one of those people that scoots in at the last minute, and I want those people who scoot in at the last minute to not feel like we started without them. So you can scoot in and visit with your neighbor for about 7 minutes here, and we'll get started.
Somebody took the chase. As if you don't. As if you don't deserve it. You were on the East Coast recently, I think. He lived in New Haven, did he? Oh, okay. Now, are these medical school classmates or college classmates? You still keep up with them? Really?
I was just walking around the room trying to find out which students were here. Brian Russell. Hey. Ruben, right? Yes. Okay. Sure. Yeah. Of course. They're a little older. Yeah? That's a good major.
I had to come up with something on
Yeah, you know what happens to be a plant having the trip. My mother had cardiac. So you know, in Canada, you never want to have a heart attack in Canada because what they did was that she's very healthy. She looked younger than I am, and they looked at her. They were 6 hour days and said, "What are you still doing? You shouldn't be here. You should be dead. You know, you're 94. You know what? So anyhow, what did you no angiogram, no nothing, and what did you like? Yeah. I'll bet it is. Much different. Yeah. You don't realize it. It's done, but you don't realize it. You don't realize it though. Nobody knows. The only one that knows is the one who's giving the care. Who did? He died. Really?
And there's 3 over here if you need more.
I thought he did that in Mexico. Because I saw him from New Mexico. I thought that's where he was. Walter retired fairly young. Wasn't that?
Jessica.
Hey.
How are you?
I'm good. Hopefully you have a seat somewhere. Yeah.
He would have died. He hadn't had life. He'd be dead.
I'm trying.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. He he was an interesting guy.
Okay, everybody followed instructions so well, so I think we've almost filled up our seats. I missed the great opportunity for a pun, like we're gonna not start early and have a shotgun start. Let's see, do we have, are there any, does anybody know if there are any, we still have a few people who don't have seats. Does anybody have a seat next to them? There's one seat up here at the front. There are two seats up at the front on the end, so we've still got a few. So those of you in the back can usher the people forward. I'm Carol Lovelady. I'm the director of the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum, and I'm so happy to see all of you here tonight. Thank you very much for coming. I think it's very appropriate that we have a historian who is here tonight. Now, grammatically, am I supposed to say a historian or an historian? Okay, we're changing. So, me and Alex, being American, me and Alex we can say we have a historian tonight, or Alex and I can say we have an historian here with us tonight. But this is a tremendous evening for the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum, which grew out of the history department. Dr. Hattie Anderson was a history professor here. We've got people here who knew her, and she was the beginning of the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum. She wanted to collect the history of the people who lived in this region. And look at this wonderful museum that we have today with over 2 million objects, a fabulous collection, and a room full of supporters here on a Tuesday night. It's very appropriate this evening that this would be the first in the series of the Nall lectures. It's not the first lecture, but it's the first lecture for our season, because we have Dr. Gary Nall here with us tonight, a beloved history professor in the history department, and someone who has been very, very good to the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum, who has been a friend of the museum for many years, who served as president of the board, and who served for many, many years as editor of the Panhandle Plains Historical Review. So we're off to a great start, and I am not sure who I'm supposed to turn the microphone over to right now. I believe it's Alex. So thank you for coming, and take it away, Alex.
Oh, good evening. I'm Alex Hunt. I'm a professor of English here at WT, and for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been the editor of the Panhandle Plains Historical Review. I'm currently working on my last issue of that, by the way. Not that the review won't go on, but that I'm going to be turning over the editorship to Dr. Marty Coleman from the history department, and that's been a great honor for me to have been in that role. About a year ago, or a little over a year ago, we started the Center for the Study of the American West here at West Texas A&M. And our signature events are these biannual Gary L. Nall Lectures in Western American Studies. Again, CSAW, as we call it, the Center for the Study of the American West. This mic is sort of going in and out, isn't it? No? Okay. We've had several of these lectures so far. We had Patricia Limerick about a year ago. We had S.C. Gwynn last spring. For this coming April, we have in the works Stephen Harrigan, the Texas novelist and essayist, although that's not confirmed yet, but we're working on that. Also, in addition to putting on these kinds of events, the Center for the Study of the American West has some other initiatives. We awarded our first round of research grants. We give research grants to WT faculty and staff and students who are pursuing some research in the American West, in whatever discipline that might be. And we also give research grants to researchers from elsewhere who wish to come here to WT to use the research center here at the museum, or the special collections at Cornett Library, or some other regional papers. And beyond that, we're also working on curricular initiatives. We have a a minor in Western American Studies here at WT, which we are currently revising and revitalizing. We also have an internship program that we're running around the Center for the Study of the American West and the Panhandle Plains Historical Review. So we have a lot going on. Going great guns. Huh? Tonight we have the honor of hearing a lecture from Brian DeLay. Dr. DeLay, who received his PhD from Harvard in 2004, is professor of history at the University of California at Berkeley. His first book was called War of a Thousand Deserts, Indian Raids and the U.S.-Mexican War. That was published in 2008. This book shows the degree to which indigenous peoples, notably the Comanches, pursued their own diplomatic, trade, and military strategies between the U.S. and Mexico, and how those indigenous actors shaped the relationship between the United States and Mexico and Texas during this crucial period. This is an excellent example of borderlands history, which not only demonstrates the complexity inherent in, we think of a border as a line on a map or a line in the sand, but really we're talking about a broad, complex borderlands, a zone in which one has to take historical methods, I think, in different directions. And so one of the things that fascinates me in reading Professor DeLay's work is the degree to which he has to work indirectly often through historical records to piece together and sort of infer, in some cases, the motivations and the diplomatic ideas that the Comanches were operating under. Anyway, it's a fascinating study, and I really recommend it. We'll have this book, by the way, for sale out in the hall there, and there'll be a book signing after the lecture. This book, War of a Thousand Deserts, won, I think, 8 awards from various historical associations, including the Robert M. Utley Award and the W. Turrentine Jackson Award from the Western History Association, and the Southwest Book Award from the Border Regional Library Association, and the Sons of the Republic of Texas Summerfield G. Roberts Best Book Award. Dr. DeLay also edited a collection of scholarship called North American Borderlands, which has had a significant impact in shaping the field of borderlands history. Now, his new project has to do with the history of the U.S. arms trade. This began with a return to the 19th century U.S.-Mexico borderlands, but has expanded geographically and historically in scope. And the title of his new book, forthcoming from W.W. Norton, is Shoot the State, Guns, Freedom, and Domination in the Americas, 1774 to 1934. So now it has a hemispheric scope and 150 years. Is that right? I'm not very good at math. But his talk today originates in that new book project. And I think you're going to find this a fascinating and thought-provoking lecture. If you like the experience that this lecture affords, please consider helping us. The Center for the Study of the American West is engaged in all kinds of wonderful fundraising activities, including building the Gary L. Nall Endowment Fund, which supports this lecture series. And you can easily get a hold of me or others involved by just, well, you could just look me up here at the museum. So also we have some literature at the back of the room you can pick up that has some information. If you would, take a moment, make sure your cell phone is silenced. I'd appreciate that. I'll take a moment to thank various contributors, the Distinguished Lecture Committee at West Texas A&M University, the Sybil B. Harrington College of Fine Arts and Humanities, Cornett Library, and of course the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum, and also Humanities Texas for their support of this event. And so with that, please join me in welcoming our fall 2017 Nall lecturer, Dr. Brian DeLay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Alex. Thank you also to Tim Bowman. I'm thrilled to be here. I've had such a great time since I arrived. Went and saw the canyon today, which I had never seen before. blew my mind, totally wonderful. And then the museum is, of course, astonishing and an incredible treasure house. But let me just observe that I think maybe the best resource for the study of this region's history is this passionate community of people who care about that history. You probably already know it, but I'll tell you, lots of places around the country, there are people that care about their history, but you don't get a turnout like this. So thank you all for taking time to come and hear about what I have to say tonight. As my kids would tell you, I have a tendency to go on and on and on and on and on, so I'm going to discipline myself by trying to stick to my text tonight so I don't go on forever. Try to talk for about 40-45 minutes. And I'm going to stay over here also because I've got some images to show you tonight as well. I'm going to talk to you tonight about how the U.S. arms trade influenced the first century of Mexico's independent history. And as Alex said, this is part of a larger book that I'm working on called Shoot the State. And the point of that book really is to try to explain how access to guns or lack of access to guns shaped who had power over who in the Western Hemisphere from the American Revolution to World War II. And it's interesting to me partly because it's a topic that very few historians have been very interested in, and because access to guns was critically important for all these different political projects that ended up shaping the modern Americas. So that's the bigger picture, and what I'm going to try to give you tonight is a slice of that larger hemispheric story having to do specifically with Mexico and with Mexico's relationship with Texas. Mexico is the perfect place to try to assess the importance of the arms trade because the arms trade had an outsized influence in that country's history. And that was for a variety of reasons, but the single most important reason is that Mexico shared a massive land border with the hemisphere's great producer and exporter of firearms. And that fact, the fact that it shared this gun frontier with the United States, ends up influencing Mexican history in really profound and I think neglected ways, from the struggle for independence all the way through the Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century. And that's the story I'm going to try to introduce you to today. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that this is not simply a 19th and early 20th century story. Of course, the arms trade from the United States across the Texan gun frontier continues to shape Mexican history in important ways today. The sign that you see behind me is a good reminder that that's true. This is a sign that went up in 2012 at a tragic high point in Mexico's drug-related violence. President Felipe Calderón, who you see here in the picture, had 3 tons of confiscated American guns melted down and hammered into this massive sign. And I realize this is not the best picture, you can't really see, but what it says is "no more weapons" with a big exclamation point. So this is 3 tons of guns made to make this huge sign. And he put this sign up at a bridge connecting El Paso to Ciudad Juarez. So this sign, in English, right? I mean, this is after all a sign put up by Mexicans in Mexico. The sign in English was a stark protest against the so-called Iron River of guns flowing from the United States, mostly through Texas, into Mexico. Now, in the United States, the media did cover this story to a certain extent, but predictably and unsurprisingly, the story quickly got swallowed up in the partisan battles over gun policy in the United States. And this is just a taste of all the different editorials on either side of the issue that you can find that sort of acknowledge that fact. The way in which this story got swallowed up by partisan politics was regrettable, I think, because it obscured the scale and the tragedy of the problem. And it really was a very significant problem and continues to be. 2012, the year that Calderón's sign went up, there were some 6,700 licensed U.S. arms dealers in the border region. That's more than 3 arms dealers for every mile of the U.S.-Mexican border. The best estimates, of course, very difficult to figure out exactly how many guns might have been going to Mexico, so these are estimates. But the best estimates suggest that straw buyers, that is, say, people that went in ostensibly to buy guns for themselves, but in fact to sell them to others who were going to take them across the border, that straw buyers shopping at these different places along the border and elsewhere in the United States purchased about 250,000 guns just in 2012 to smuggle into Mexico. Now, guns are one thing, significant problem. Ammunition is perhaps an even bigger problem because, of course, it cannot be reused. The demand for ammunition is absolutely immense in Mexico. And it's much easier to legally obtain in bulk in the United States and then to smuggle into Mexico. So this sign was, the sign that went up was meant to protest this and to try to attract media attention to this. But Juarez's mayor was uncomfortable with this sign. He believed that it was bad for tourism, which was critical to Juarez's economy, and so he didn't want to see that sign up any longer. So in 2015, he had it tore down. But just in case the message had not been received, he saved the dot underneath the exclamation point and had it sent to the U.S. Embassy in Juarez. That's the dot right here. Now, you probably won't be surprised to learn that the Mexican government gets a lot of its own arsenal, right, its own guns and ammunition from the United States as well. So it's not only cartels that are getting their guns from the United States, it's the government too. So while it would have been less catchy, Calderon's sign would have been more honest if it had read, "No more weapons!" exclamation point. Parentheses, unless they're for us. Close parentheses. With that edit, the sign would have been perfectly intelligible to Mexicans throughout the whole of the 19th century. Right? They would have totally understood that sentiment. No more weapons unless they're for us. So in my talk this evening, what I want to do is try to convince you that the Texas gun frontier helped to hardwire instability into the first century of Mexico's independent existence, even though everyone in Mexico depended upon it. But before I do that, I need to just begin with a very simple but I think underappreciated point. And that is that it is and always has been really difficult to mass produce firearms. Throughout the century after independence in Spanish America, so the wars for independence in Spanish America, basically 1810 through the early 1820s. Throughout the century after those wars, the largest post-colonial states in Latin America, so Argentina, for example, Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, most definitely, the largest post-colonial states in the Western Hemisphere all believed that it was crucial to their national security to build their own domestic arms industries. And they all failed to do that in the first century after independence. Only the United States managed to build a significant arms industry during the 19th century in the Western Hemisphere. Part of the reason that this is so, a very important part of the reason that this is so, is that firearms technology advanced more rapidly in the mid to late 19th century than in any era before or probably since. Critical changes included the transition from flintlock to percussion cap, including and also modifications to bullets that for the first time made rifles practical battlefield weapons, the advent of mass-produced jacketed ammunition, refinements in breech loading and repeating rifles, and the invention of smokeless powder, expanding bullets, and reliable machine guns. And all along the way, advances in standardization, interchangeable parts, metallurgy, and industrialized production increased the efficiency and the standardization of the output and lowered the market price for firepower, while at the same time dramatically increasing the investments and the technological know-how necessary to compete, right, to make cutting-edge firearms in quantity. So in other words, the technological horizon just moved too quickly, even for these large, in some ways wealthy, post-colonial Latin American states that were determined to build their own arms industry. They weren't able to. That meant that, like the people who tried to defy states, the people in charge of states had to engage with the international arms trade. This is true for all of these countries, and it's absolutely true for the people in charge of government in Mexico. So, with that context in mind, let me now turn to this capsule history of the Texas gun frontier and the travails of Mexican history. And I'm going to start with Mexico's War for Independence. Within weeks of the beginning of that war in 1810, radical priest Miguel Hidalgo y Castillo had attracted a huge army, something like 80,000 people, and had sent these people marching toward Mexico City. So the ruling elite in Mexico City were terrified by this movement. The problem, however, while these 80,000 people dramatically outnumbered royal troops, almost none of them had guns. So at the critical Battle of Calderon Bridge outside of Guadalajara in 1811, for example, these insurgents outnumbered royal forces by far more than 2 to 1, but only about 1 out of 30 of them had muskets, and they were slaughtered and driven from the field. Once the insurgent force scattered and Hidalgo himself had been captured and executed, his successors, the people that tried to keep this movement going in the aftermath of this terrible defeat, worked feverishly but unsuccessfully to try to import guns. Why did they fail? Well, one of the important obstacles had to do with timing. Europeans still produced the vast majority of the world's firearms in 1810, 1811. And in that moment, Europeans were madly shoveling nearly every gun they made into the bottomless pit of the Napoleonic Wars. So that meant that insurgents in Mexico and elsewhere in Spanish America had very little luck turning to Europe to get their guns. So practically they had to concentrate with the United States. So the US was still only a 3rd-tier arms producer in 1811. It was, however, an avid importer and exporter of firearms. And the United States, in fact, got into some pretty bitter diplomatic disputes with the great powers because it insisted that its citizens had the right to export guns wherever they wish, so long as they were willing to take the risks. So they had a reputation and a growing sector of the export economy devoted to war material. I think the French were correct to believe, for example, that the Haitian Revolution and Haitian independence, which was consummated in 1804, that this would have been impossible had it not been for the tons of gunpowder and the many tens of thousand guns that American merchants sold to Haitian rebels throughout the late 18th and early 19th century. Now, once the independence movement erupted in South America, again in 1810, dozens of well-heeled emissaries left these port cities in South America, sailed on ships to the United States in order to try to arrange for arms contracts. So for example, Simón Bolívar sent his cultured brother Vicente to Philadelphia to buy arms. And Vicente Bolívar arrived in a ship jammed full of coffee, indigo, and hides to sell quickly. He even had a little bit of gold. He arranged for private meetings with prominent politicians in Washington, and he even was able to partner with the richest merchant in the United States. So these are people with very high contacts and quite a lot of resources. Mexico's insurgents, in contrast, didn't have these connections, they didn't have this polish, they didn't have these resources. So what they do is they send a humble note to Secretary of State James Monroe, who they address as Tomás Monroy. So these are, this is the disadvantage they're working on. They're not even sure who this fellow is. And they ask him urgently, they say, we request that we be supplied with arms, men, and money, or as much as may be, especially arms. As for recompense, they promised vaguely, quote, everything will be returned in good time. Now, you can imagine, right? A successful armed movement is built of many, many people. And some of them are not going to be in a position to know how to handle the high stakes field of international diplomacy and international business contacts. And these were fighting men, and they were trying to get the help that they needed, and they didn't know how to properly approach the United States government or patrons in Mexico or in the United States. And consequently, this letter was completely ignored. It didn't even get an answer, let alone the guns that they had hoped that they would get. Mexico's insurgency would never get the resources that it needed, partly because it didn't have the polish of its South American counterparts. The letter goes unanswered, as I said, and the movement from start to finish is totally hobbled by insufficient weaponry. This is crucial but generally overlooked context for the destructive fighting that raged here in Texas during Mexico's War for Independence. With hardly any ships, little money, few international mercantile connections, and without control over a significant Gulf port where they could land weapons shipments by sea, Hidalgo's successor only had one realistic hope, and that was to ship guns and ammunition overland from Louisiana through Texas and into Mexico proper. Venture capitalists in New Orleans formed an association to advance money and weapons to these insurgents in hopes of enjoying privileged access to economic opportunities in independent Mexico. The Crown understood this. Took them a while to figure it out, but they came to understand the great danger that they faced in Texas. And so they too began to prioritize the province's defense. And you will all know the results. Bitter, bitter fighting in this relatively unpopulated part of Spanish America. Fighting there reduced the already tiny colonial population by more than half and destroyed most of the animal wealth that Tejanos depended upon to survive. And crucially, this destruction, both of population and of wealth, would play a critical role in Mexico's disastrous decision to invite Anglo-American colonization into Texas. So it's very much linked to that. Now, driven from Texas by this successful effort at the Crown to drive away these would-be insurgents and effectively cut off from the international arms trade, by 1815, Mexico's insurgency fragments into largely disconnected pockets of regional rebellion and guerrilla warfare. The heartbreak of having too few arms is a refrain that you can see again and again and again in accounts of this war. William Davis Robinson, for example, a passionate American propagandist for the insurgency, a guy who himself had tried to smuggle arms into Mexico and went and tried to fight for the insurgency and wrote all these pamphlets and letters to the editor and tried his best to drum up American support for it. He, for example, recalls in his memoir how many a time he saw rebel leader Manuel Mier y Terran's fine black eyes glisten with tears, this is his phrase, when he contemplated what he could do with only a few thousand muskets, if only he could get them. Independence, of course, does come to Mexico, despite all these problems in 1821, but it comes to Mexico because royalist officers who had militarily been in control of the situation basically throughout the entirety of the insurgency, abandon the Spanish crown and partner with the remaining insurgents. So Mexico does achieve independence, 1821. Now, as an independent country, Mexico needed arms to govern effectively. This was very urgent, right? It needed to build up an arsenal adequate for the task of governing this massive, massive territory. One of the major problems, however, was that they had no money. The war had been enormously destructive in terms of lives and infrastructure, far more so than the American Revolution, and they needed to find both someone who was willing to give them the money and then to sell them the guns. So they needed two things. Consequently, Mexico's leaders go to, or send representatives to capitals throughout Europe looking for a patron. In 1824 and 1825, they find one. They secure, or two rather, they secure two major loans from British firms, guaranteed by 2/3 of all of Mexico's future customs receipts. So really the only reliable revenue stream that this new fragile government had was customs revenues. And they promised these banks in London, if you give us these loans, we'll back them up with the customs revenues, which is why these banks agreed. Barclay, Herring, Richardson and Company, which is a forerunner to one of the world's most powerful banks today, gave the largest loan. And much of this loan was then converted into British war material that the British government had dumped on the market after the Napoleonic Wars. So here's what they bought. They bought 4 frigates that had been equipped for war, 5,000 pairs of pistols, 14,000 carbines, and 70,000 East India pattern Brown Bess muskets. Now, this was supposed to be just the beginning of a sustained arming campaign where the state was going to acquire the tools necessary to ensure that it could govern effectively and with confidence. And then the economy would grow, there'd be stability. All these things were supposed to be connected. But Mexico was not going to be able to secure another major arms deal this size for more than a century, because the Republic defaulted on these loans just 3 years after it concluded them. Mexico would in fact spend the next 60 years in sovereign default, more or less barred from international capital markets, hopelessly unable to fund its own government, and consequently Mexico was hugely unstable in these decades. And this, I think, is a really important point that sometimes isn't appreciated as much as it should be. Mexico had huge problems in the 19th century. But when your country is as big and as complicated and as diverse as Mexico was, and your government has no money, it's unsurprising that they were in the turmoil that they were in, and there was a whole lot of turmoil. In the 35 years between 1821 and 1856, Mexico had 53 separate governments operating under 4 different constitutions. Now, there's a recurring cast of characters. You've all heard of Santa Anna, obviously, so there's people that cycle in and out of power. So it's not quite as crazy as this figure makes it sound, but it was pretty crazy. And the lack of stability was this constant problem for Mexico throughout all these early decades. It also meant that every government and those who were opposed to whatever government happened to be in power at the moment needed weapons. So there's a constant demand for war material in Mexico. And no one in Mexico was going to get on credit, right, after the sovereign default. So for a generation after independence in 1821, Mexico's leaders were going to have to face crisis after crisis after crisis with a pretty modest arsenal that was more or less fixed. And the adequacy of this arsenal was tested in the mid-1830s when governing elites in Mexico City instituted constitutional changes meant to centralize political power in the capital. And one of the reasons that they make these decisions is because there had been so much chaos. And you had patriots of goodwill who really wanted the best for their country saying, we've tried a federalist system, and look what it got us. It's now time to go back to a system that we have historical experience of working, that is centralized power in Mexico City. So this was the logic here. This, of course, was deeply unpopular in the States. Federalist uprisings erupt in several different states, and the central government manages to handily suppress the most threatening rebellion, or at least at the beginning, what seemed like the most threatening rebellion, in the powerful state of Zacatecas. Zacatecas had the biggest militia, it had the most guns, and it was really, once the government had overpowered Zacatecas, many in Mexico City thought, okay, now everything's going to be all right. Of course, it was not going to be all right. After Zacatecas falls, the epicenter of Federalist resistance moves north, of course, to the state of Coahuila y Texas. There were zealous Federalists, both in Coahuila and in Texas. But officials in these places had nothing like the guns, the men, or the money that their counterparts in Zacatecas had. They did, however, have a land border with the United States, proximity to New Orleans and its arms market, and an increasingly precious resource, cotton country. Since 1824, Coahuila's Federalist leaders had overseen the colonization program that all of you know better than I do, that brought tens of thousands of Anglo-Americans and enslaved African Americans into Texas. With President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna's army marching their way, Coahuila's Federalists made a desperate bargain. They frantically began selling off state resources in return for men and weapons. On May 13, 1835, the state legislature deeded 5 million acres of land in East Texas to a trio of shadowy American land speculators who promised to raise and arm 1,000 men and keep them in the field for a year in defense of federalism. Now, for Texan leaders who had partnered with these political elites in Coahuila, this seemed like a gross betrayal of the partnership and of the entire project. So bitterly resentful that this had happened, and worse, bitterly resentful that these leaders in Saltillo had auctioned off this land to known scoundrels, land that many in Texas had their own eyes on, American colonists in Texas hatched their own land for arms deals. Some of these were vague and democratic. As with Sam Houston's well-publicized plea from late 1835, he said, quote, "If volunteers from the United States will join their brethren in this section, they will receive liberal bounties of land. Let each man come with a good rifle and 100 rounds of ammunition, and come soon." that was one way to pitch the deal, but deals cut by Texan agents in New Orleans ended up being less famous but far more consequential. These Texan agents were authorized to exchange up to 1.25 million acres of prime cotton land in exchange for war material. And many of the largest deals in New Orleans that were hatched in these desperate weeks were put together by a group of influential merchants and bankers in the city, calling them the Committee on Texas Affairs. That's what they call themselves. This committee ensured that several hundred of the city's guns traveled to Texas with the best of all possible accoutrements, men ready to shoot them. In return for their services, committee members received large and choice grants of land in Texas cotton country. Now, given their deepening investments in the region, this committee in New Orleans insisted that Texans abandon the broader cause of federalism and go for independence. Many rebels, of course, had wanted this from the beginning. But key figures like Stephen F. Austin had insisted deep into the conflict that standing by Federalist partners in Coahuila was the best way forward. But increasingly dependent on New Orleans for its supply of men and weapons, and feeling betrayed by their erstwhile Mexican partners in Coahuila, Austin and like-minded moderates soon reconciled themselves to independence. The eventual Texan triumph in 1836, of course, had less to do with superior arms than it did to do with Santa Anna's disastrous tactical mistakes. But here, as in so many other watershed moments of this era, the arms trade, though insufficient to explain the outcome of Texan independence, was indisputably necessary to the outcome. Sam Houston could not possibly have capitalized on Santa Anna's terrible errors had he not obtained arms and supplies in New Orleans. After the rebellion, the Texans apologetically renegotiate their land for guns deals with their partners in New Orleans. And this is something that happens all the time, right? In a moment of existential desperation, you promise anything. And then when you win, and you're in a position of strength, well, it's time to renegotiate and have a more realistic understanding. It's also true that once Houston triumphed, he and his men got a close look at those India-patterned Brown Bess muskets that Mexico had bankrupted itself for, because Texans brought 800 of them home from San Jacinto. And here you see one of these with the Mexican eagle stamped on the lock. It's not a super easy thing to see, but trust me, that's what it is. So, the first truly disastrous calamity of independent Mexico's history, 1836. Meanwhile, Indians armed with guns were creating another increasingly desperate crisis over an even larger portion of Mexico's territory. And in fact, these two disasters, the Texan independence movement and the increasingly destructive violence by indigenous peoples like Comanches, Apaches, Kiowas, Navajos, and others, they were linked. While Comanches and Kiowas in particular obtained most of their guns and ammunition from other Indians, it's also true that Texans armed them as well. Even in the midst of the rebellion, Santa Anna paused to denounce Texan colonists for engaging in what he called the, quote, wicked but lucrative trade with Indians. Indigenous warriors were able to traverse all or parts of 7 states in Mexico, and this is really what I talked about in that first book, War of a Thousand Deserts, in part because they were far better armed than almost all of the Mexicans that they encountered on their journeys. And as these raiders pushed further south, right, beyond Coahuila, Nuevo León, Chihuahua, Tamaulipas, beyond these northern states into states further closer to the center of Mexico, San Jacinto, San Potosí, Zacatecas, and Durango, they encountered populations that were far larger, far richer, and had been actively disarmed by the government. In the aftermath of a particularly devastating 1,000-man Comanche and Kiowa invasion through Zacatecas in 1845, for example, one official complained that his department had, quote, been caught completely by surprise, without a single carbine or lance, and absolutely bereft of all resources, since the system has not only starved us to death, but has also left us without nails to scratch ourselves. Mexico's harried government responded to this crisis and to Texas by saying, we're going to fix this. We're going to reconquer Texas. We're going to defeat the Indios Barbaros, as they called them. But of course, the traumas of the past decade had made governing Mexico so complicated, so impossible. The resources were so scarce. And the toll that it had taken on the army and its arsenal was so severe that none of these things were going to be possible. Replenishing and modernizing Mexico's arsenal meant spending money. And spending money on anything other than debt repayment meant running afoul of Mexico's innumerable creditors and their champions in foreign embassies in Mexico City, who were always ready to get right in there with the defense minister and demand that state money go to repaying the debt. Mexico's army limped into the mid-1840s with a dwindling number of outmoded guns, only 33,000 of them, according to the Minister of War, and some 635 cannon of various calibers, most of which, dated from the colonial period. That this arsenal was unequal to the national task became very clear by late 1847, when nearly all of it had fallen into the hands of the United States Army during the US-Mexican War. After every successful battle, US forces seized weapons from their Mexican adversaries, and they found very little to esteem in the weapons that they confiscated. After his victory at the Battle of Cerro Gordo, for example, General Winfield Scott determined that the 4,000 muskets he seized that day were too substandard to be used by his men, so he had them all destroyed. And he does this again and again and again and again as he moves through Mexico. Some in Mexico, even after Scott captures Mexico City, some in Mexico say we have to continue to fight. But it is not at all clear how the state could have possibly continued to fight. In the spring of 1848, Mexico's shocked war ministry reported that the government had 48 functioning cannon and 121 muskets. That's it for the whole country. Now, of course, there were lots of guns in Mexico, but that's what the government had in its control. So at the conclusion of the US-Mexican War in 1848, Mexico was not only less than half the size that it had been before the war, but internally fragmented, groaning under massive internal and external debts, and as gun-poor as it had ever been in its independent history. Cash payments from the US, nominally meant to indemnify Mexico for the land that it surrendered, did help the government limp along in the first few years after the war. But by the mid-1850s, a destructive pattern of coups and rebellions and liberal conservative infighting reasserted itself in Mexico, and Mexico slipped into a very familiar pattern. Rival factions in these conflicts looked to foreign patrons to give them money and weapons. And here you really begin to see a very destructive pattern take root in Mexico, and that is the phenomenon of different factions saying, we need guns to do what we want, we don't have the money to buy the guns, so let's go find a patron and promise them something about the future. Right? Once we win, I'm going to give you X, Y, and Z. And they make these pitches to financial elites all on up and down the US seaboard and in European capitals. And I think that these financial elites looked at this as a kind of venture capitalism, with really the expectation that we're not going to see this money again, probably. But it's not that much money. And in the very unlikely event that these guys prevail, then we're going to have all kinds of privileges and concessions in Mexico. So the kinds of privileges I'm talking about here are customs receipts, mining privileges, and eventually railroad contracts. That's going to be the real plum that people are especially interested in these financial capitals. Liberals in these conflicts with conservatives look primarily to the United States, so the border with Texas becomes extremely important once Mexico's own civil war erupts. This is the War of the Reform in the 1850s. 1857, this war really gets going. And for the next 4 years, merchants and regional brokers on both sides of the border make a huge amount of money shuffling arms north and south, with liberal leaders sometimes exchanging public lands in return for war material. Now, of course, the US Civil War begins not long after, right? Only months after Benito Juarez and Mexico's liberals triumph in this devastating war of reform. In response to the Civil War, this extensive smuggling infrastructure that had built up along the Texas gun frontier, it chugs into reverse. Confederate cotton starts going south into Mexico and then out into the Atlantic market. And European-made supplies, including desperately needed guns and ammunition, went into northeastern Mexico, across the Rio Grande, and through Texas on its way to Confederate armies. Hundreds of thousands of guns and thousands of tons of powder pour into the United States and the Confederacy during the years 1861 to 1865, through Texas and through other points. And what you see here is a cartoon lampooning and criticizing John Bull for ostensibly being the ally to the United States, but actually sending huge amounts of war material to Confederates. And the graph you see at the bottom is data from British customs records that I put together. And what you can see is that British arms shipments to the New World are not very significant. You see a little bump at the beginning, that's Brazil in the green, and they don't even hardly register. And then they begin to pick up in 1858, 1859, and then of course they absolutely shoot up right around 1861, 1862, 1863. And the red are guns that are sent to the Union, and then that cluster of smaller kind of almost ice cream colored little bumps there at the bottom, those are all different islands and Mexico, different sites throughout the greater Caribbean where British merchants sent guns knowing that their ultimate destination was to the Confederacy. So, with the advent of the Civil War and the unbelievably gigantic demand for guns and ammunition in the United States, it meant that Juarez and Mexican factions of different kinds had an extremely difficult time getting the arms that they needed. And this was an enormous problem when, seizing upon the perennial problem of Mexico's unpaid debts, France invades Mexico and installs a European prince as Emperor Maximilian I. This is happening during the Civil War, and Juarez desperately sought arms for his troops in U.S. markets. But Lincoln prohibits all arms exports from the United States in 1862, and this holds until the end of the war. So Juarez is unable to get arms across the Texas gun frontier in quantity like he used to be able to, and he steadily loses ground, and in fact, by 1865 has to flee across the border into Texas, and Maximilian and the conservatives are triumphant in Mexico. So 1865 is the low point. But by then, the US Civil War, of course, would soon be over, and the export ban would be lifted. And, crucially, huge stockpiles of guns that had been used by the Union Army or used by the Confederacy and then seized by the Union Army by the end of the war were now obsolete. And the federal government, over the next several years, auctions off something on the order of 1.6 million rifles and muskets to private buyers, who then sell them at home and abroad. Juarez needed a lot of these guns. He had absolutely no way to pay for them, other than promises. And this ends up being very important to Mexico's later history. Juarez dispatches dozens of agents to cities throughout the United States, and he has them sell millions of dollars worth of Mexican government bonds at a discount. He sells these to US military officers, to arms makers, to industrialists, to export houses, to financiers, to shipping concerns. He sells them to politicians. The list of Mexico's erstwhile patrons reads like a who's who of America's incipient Gilded Age. They include bankers J.P. Morgan and his brother Ed, William Aspinwall of the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, Anson Phelps and William B. Dodge, founders of the immense Phillips Dodge Mining Corporation, Moses Taylor, one of the nation's richest men and longtime head of what would eventually become Citibank, Railroad tycoons Russell Sage and Jay Gould, the explosives innovator and entrepreneur Henry DuPont, and a very powerful person who is these days almost totally forgotten, an arms exporter and ammunition manufacturer from New York City named Marcellus Hartley. Marcellus Hartley is probably the most dangerous man you've never heard of. This fellow was, with no real close competition, the most powerful arms dealer in the Western Hemisphere for most of the 19th century, and a very important figure in this particular drama with Mexico. So these investors collectively provided the money and the contacts and the guns necessary to re-equip Juarez's liberal army and allow them to go back into Mexico, drive the French out, and eventually execute Maximilian. And because for most of this period, the French Navy effectively controlled most of Mexico's ports, the great majority of this material had to cross the Texas gun frontier. So the bill for all of this money and all of this help and all of these guns comes due in 1867, as soon as Juarez triumphs and his forces take Mexico City and execute Maximilian. American creditors immediately demand repayment for all these bonds. And Juarez immediately says, well, hold on a second, right? So it's very much like what I told you in Texas a moment ago. He says, I'm not so sure all those bonds are legitimate. You dealt with an agent, I've never even heard of that guy. How do I know this is the real deal? Anyway, we just had a major war. It's gonna take us a long time to get this money together, so on and so on and so on. In response to this stonewalling, the largest of the creditors in the United States formed something called the New York Bondholders Association in 1868 to pursue redress collectively. Marcellus Hartley, the arms dealer I mentioned a moment ago, sat on its executive committee and he mobilized lawyers, State Department officials, and congressional champions to help press the case that these debts need to be repaid. Meanwhile, the bondholders and other American capitalists hatched a multitude of business schemes in Mexico. And I think, in fact, this was their ambition all along. Mexico had earned its reputation for default. These men, these powerful capitalists in the United States were no fools. They could not have possibly expected Mexico to promptly repay the letter of the bills that they had been dealing with over the past few years, certainly not quickly. I think instead the reason that they agreed to these, to buy these bonds and agreed to help Mexico was not for prompt repayment, but instead for leverage. Leverage over lucrative business deals. Land deals, mining concessions, commercial privileges, and again, above all, railroad contracts. Juarez did a fair job stalling until his death in 1872. But pressure mounted dramatically on his ally and successor, a man named Sebastian Lerdo. Lerdo, like Juarez, was a proud nationalist, and he had no means to repay all the debts that American creditors claimed were owed them, and he had no intention of handing over to the economic kings of the kingdom, keys to the kingdom, to American investors. In 1875, after beating rival, lesser-known general named Porfirio Diaz, after beating Porfirio Diaz in that year's presidential election, Lerdo even canceled all outstanding U.S. railroad concessions, except for one that he happened to be involved in, and he rejected a bilateral trade agreement that the investors believed was the best shot they had at recouping their money. So, in 1876, the bondholders, including Marcellus Hartley, conspired with their frustrated colleagues in the railroad business to help Diaz, this young general, depose Lerdo in a coup. The New York Bondholders Committee alone sent in $320,000 through an intermediary, and arms and ammunition shipments soon began arriving for Diaz at the Texas border. Equipped with this money and with these guns, Diaz crossed the border into Mexico, deposed Lerdo, and eventually won election to the presidency and would effectively control the government of Mexico for the next 33 years. Now there's a crooked but unbroken line between Mexico's frantic scramble for arms in the 1850s and the 1860s on the one hand, and the rise of the Diaz era, the so-called Porfiriato, on the other. Coups were nothing new by this point in Mexico's history, but the direct and decisive influence of American capital in toppling an elected government abroad, that was still pretty new in the 1870s. As Juarez and Lerdo understood, all that was required was the investments that gave American businessmen the sense of entitlement necessary to intervene in foreign governments. And in Mexico's case, those investments had their modest but crucial beginnings with the arms trade. Gun poverty had contributed to political instability and military defeat in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. And gun poverty had driven Mexicans to make rash, even impossible deals with American capitalists in the 1850s and the 1860s. Juarez and Lerdo balked at the high price of those deals, and the result was the Porfiriato, an era synonymous with rapid development, savage inequality, and foreign ownership of most of Mexico's economy. Now, once he's in power, Diaz needed steady infusions of arms in order to sustain his program. And this is partly because that program was so ambitious and so very coercive. So he needed guns in order to fulfill this ambition, but he also needed guns because guns had an astonishing, almost magical ability to disappear in Mexico. And this is a problem faced by all troubled states. This isn't something unique to Mexico. Just as states need arms to hold on to power, states need power to hold on to arms. Poorly cared for, broken, destroyed, lost, stolen, very big part of the story here, sold, traded, secreted away by independent-minded military commanders, right? Their arms could exit government power in a huge number of ways. This had been clear enough by the time of the US-Mexican War, when the Army could only mobilize a third as many guns as it had purchased from Great Britain in the 1820s, right? It's pretty shocking that in only 2 decades, 2/3 of their arsenal disappears. Once Maximilian had been deposed in the 1868, Juarez should, in theory, have been abundantly supplied with guns, right? Guns have been pouring into Mexico for the entirety of the 1850s and the 1860s because of the War of Reform and then this massive titanic struggle against Maximilian. But the fact is, Juarez did not have abundant guns. Indeed, he found his arsenal so spare that despite these enormous debts that he owed to powerful Americans, and despite the fact that American officials were leaning on it very heavily to repay these debts promptly, he and his successor purchased more than 30,000 guns in the early 1870s. And yet, in 1881, about half a decade after Diaz seizes power, and half a decade of aggressive arms purchasing under Diaz, the Mexican national arsenal consisted of 27,000 guns. Now, I've just thrown a whole lot of numbers at you, I realize that, but my point is simply this. Guns are pouring into Mexico for all these decades, right? And yet the government never has enough, never has enough. So all of Mexico's leaders, Diaz definitely included, had to constantly engage with the international arms trade if they were going to have enough guns to govern the country. Now, Diaz was very good at this. He was very adept at navigating the international market, and this was, of course, a precondition to his long rule. In addition to large purchases from Winchester and Remington and Union Metallic Cartridge and other top American firms, his government concluded major contracts with arms makers in all of the great producing countries in Europe. So Diaz was very savvy in the sense that he wasn't going to allow his country or his regime to be uniquely dependent on one source for guns. He was careful to make sure he had many, many possible sources. Diaz bought tens of thousands of modern rifles, rifles that every year became more refined and more powerful and more reliable. He also invested in pricier and more terrible innovations, including machine guns and long-distance artillery. and he mobilized this evolving arsenal for a range of internal projects, including the conquest of Mexico's remaining independent Indian peoples. In the 1880s, his troops cooperated with American troops to kill or imprison Comanches and Apaches, who had been executing raids throughout the North for half of a century. He also moved aggressively to take land and resources from Yaqui Indians in Mexico's northwest, relying on arms markets in Arizona for their weapons. Yaqui Indians fought a losing war against the Mexican troops for most of the late 19th century. This picture actually is a pretty powerful one, given the story. This is one of the leaders of that indigenous resistance, and when he was captured, his captors had him dress up in different costumes and take a number of pictures before they killed him. The Yaquis were not capable of resisting Diaz forever. They suffered huge losses, and people killed and sold off as slaves to nightmarish Hennequin plantations in the Yucatan. And the spread of these plantations also afflicted the third and final native group that Diaz suppressed in these years. These were rebel Maya in the Yucatan Peninsula. Mayan Indians in the Yucatan had been in open rebellion against the Mexican government since 1847. It's the most successful, widespread Indian uprising in all of the Americas in the 19th century. And they were able to sustain this because they shared a land border with British Honduras. And the traders in British Honduras sold them the muskets and the gunpowder that they needed to sustain their independence. The rebel Maya only started losing their conduit to supplies by the end of the 19th century. In 1893, Britain finally promised Mexico that it would put a stop to borderlands arms trading if Mexico would agree to land concessions that they had been disputing for several years. So shortly after the turn of the century, early 20th century, Mexico purchases light draft ships from the United States. It arms them with Hotchkiss guns from Europe, and it quickly gains control of the peninsula's estuaries and rivers. And within a few years, the Mayan autonomy in the Yucatan that had been, again, this massive exception to what had happened everywhere else in the hemisphere, had been all but extinguished, and former rebels were wasting away along with Yaquis in the Hennequin fields on the peninsula. So by 1910, Diaz had overseen a vast national transformation. And this transformation was enforced and policed by a formidable security apparatus equipped with the best modern firearms. But the Texas gun frontier hadn't gone anywhere. And when the dictator finally fell, it was to a revolution largely equipped with American guns from Texas. Diaz's success, in fact, made him vulnerable to this very outcome. The destruction of Indian power in the American Southwest, the subordination of Comanches and Kiowas and Apaches in particular, and the arrival of the railroad had paved the way for rapid economic development in South Texas. For the would-be revolutionary, this meant two things. First, it meant merchants in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California now had the capital, the connections, and the transportation infrastructure necessary to quickly channel war material made in places like Connecticut or upstate New York to the border in basically unlimited quantities. Second, the proliferation of huge mining, ranching, and agricultural enterprises south of the border, just in northern Mexico, now in northern Mexican states. Most of these were American-owned by 1910. These enterprises provided revolutionaries like Pancho Villa abundant targets from whom they could extort or plunder cash or cattle or crops, which could then be traded in return for arms and ammunition from merchants north of the border. For enterprising merchants in the Southwest, it was the great bonanza of their lifetimes, right? The Mexican Revolution, the great bonanza of their lifetimes. They supplied all comers with war material of every description. The most notorious example of this non-discriminatory ethic came from the huge El Paso arms and hardware firm, Krakauer, Zork, and Moy, who once sold the Federales 1,000 kilometers of barbed wire and then immediately offered their rivals, the Constitutionalists, all the wire cutters that they had in stock. After Diaz sailed into exile and the Mexican Revolution morphed into a complex, very destructive civil war. The US government found itself whipsawing between policies about how to respond to this violence. First, Washington did nothing about the arms trade. Then it sent 20,000 troops and the forerunner to the FBI to regulate arms exports and police the border. Then it criminalized all arms exports, regardless to whom they were being sold across the border. Then it threw open the arms trade entirely again, only to close it again quickly and then make shifting exceptions, so it's a very incoherent policy. Merchants on the Texas gun frontier made a killing whenever the embargo was lifted, but they did pretty well even when the embargo was in place. Smuggling became so routine that arms dealers had lawyers standing by on retainer to provide bail to their top couriers whenever they were apprehended. So it all became a real slick operating system here. Most dramatically, President Wilson even ordered the US military to occupy Veracruz, ostensibly to prevent German shipments of machine guns and ammunition from reaching Victoriano Huerta, one of the rivals in the contest for power in Mexico, and this is a man whom Wilson totally despised. And when American troops finally left Veracruz, they left behind an enormous quantity of war material for Venustiano Carranza, whom Wilson had reluctantly decided that he was going to back. So whether they were smuggled across the border or contracted for in New York, San Francisco, or New Orleans, or delivered to favorites in bulk by the US government, American guns and ammunition prolonged the revolution, magnified its vast carnage, and absolutely helped determine its ultimate outcome. So to conclude, from the heady advance of Hidalgo's gunless thousands in 1810 to the revolution's easy retail arming a century later, the international arms trade in general and US firearms markets in particular figured decisively and repeatedly into Mexico's first 100 years of independence. Now, this is not to say that the critical decisions in Mexico's history in this 100 years were all made by foreigners. I don't believe that. On the contrary, this is a story about Mexican engagement with the international market, the international arms market, not the market's intrusions into Mexico. Mexico went looking for these guns. Now, we might brand some of these engagements Faustian, but that in itself is, of course, an argument about agency, right? Mephistopheles didn't get the bargain named after him, after all, right? So centering the arms trade doesn't export agency out of the country. Doesn't mean that Mexico's history was all determined by foreigners, but I do think it does cast new light on an old and an important problem, and that is the chronic fragility of 19th century Mexico's national state project. Historians have mostly framed Mexico's first independent history as a domestic tragedy, with occasional cameos by high-profile foreign villains who intrude temporarily into national space. And foreign villainy is certainly easy enough to find in this history. There's no question about that. But Mexicans with grand plans had to constantly think and to act outside of national borders in order to lay hands on the means of destruction. The foreign element is more important than is supposed, generally, in other words. And again, Mexicans went looking for it. Chronic turmoil, this massive Texas gun frontier, and the fact that Mexicans usually had to borrow money to get the guns and the ammunition that they wanted. All of this meant that these foreign quests generally had happier outcomes for the state's adversaries than for the state's custodians. Mexicans often managed to get the guns they needed to disrupt state projects, but they had a devil of a time getting enough guns to sustain state projects. Now, whether the travails of the state were to be regretted or not, that of course depends on your perspective. Stability is a virtue, unless what's stable is also unacceptable. Thank you very much for your time.